Over the last century, engineers have battled towering mountains, endless deserts, and the open ocean in their pursuit to connect the world. They've built highways climbing to the roof of the world, drilled tunnels through mountain ranges, and suspended roads above canyons hundreds of meters deep. Some transformed entire nations, others became engineering nightmares that took decades to complete and cost billions of dollars, but every one of them pushed the limits of what was possible. From America's interstate highway system to the continent-spanning Pan-American Highway, and from China's breathtaking expressways through the mountains to an astonishing highway built in the middle of the ocean, these are the craziest highway megaprojects ever built. Before the interstates, driving across America was an expedition. The roads were a patchwork stitched together town by town. Most of them had 2 lanes and many were unpaved, so a coast-to-coast trip could take 2 months. Dwight Eisenhower had crawled across the country in a wretched army convoy in 1919 and described his journey as a trip through darkest America with truck and tank. Eisenhower later saw the German Autobahn move an army at speed and decided that America needed that. In 1956, now the president, Eisenhower signed the law that would replace the existing road network. 41,000 miles of divided, high-speed highway built to a single national standard, paid for by a tax on every gallon of gasoline Americans pumped. It became the largest public works project in the country's history, and building it meant sending road crews at some of the most hostile terrain on the continent. The hardest fights were with the mountains. West of Denver, Interstate 70 ran straight into the Continental Divide, a wall of rocky mountain rock that the original planners never intended to cross, believing it too expensive and too difficult. Colorado's leaders lobbied to push the highway through anyway, and the engineers were left to figure out how. Their answer was to bore a tunnel through the divide at 11,000 feet, higher than any vehicle tunnel had ever been built. It nearly broke them. As the crews drilled into the mountain, they hit fault lines nobody had mapped, and the rock began to slip and shift around them. The first contractor kept trying to excavate through the moving ground until the effort bankrupted the company entirely. Machinery struggled to run at all in the thin air 2 miles up. A project estimated at $42 million ended up costing over $100 million for the first tunnel alone, and it killed 3 workers boring the first tube and 4 more boring the second. When the Eisenhower Tunnel finally opened in 1973, it was the highest vehicular tunnel in the world, a title it held for decades, until China built a higher one. Then there was Glenwood Canyon, the last piece of the entire system to be finished, and by most accounts the hardest. The interstate had to be threaded through a sheer-walled gorge cut by the Colorado River, 12 miles of cliffs with barely room for a river and a railroad at the bottom, let alone a 4-lane highway. Environmentalists fought the original design as an act of vandalism against one of the most beautiful canyons in the state, and the plan was scrapped and redrawn to disturb as little of the canyon as possible. To build it, crews used a method called balanced cantilever construction. They would build each bridge outward from the top of a single column using a crane perched on the column itself, so the structure grew into the air without heavy work on the canyon floor. The finished 12-mile stretch carries the highway on 40 separate bridges and viaducts, stacked in places on cantilevered lanes that hang one above the other along the cliff face. It opened in 1992, a year ahead of schedule, and formally completed the interstate highway system 36 years after Eisenhower signed the law. By the time it was done, the system had grown to nearly 47,000 miles and cost around $114 billion, a figure that comes to more than $600 billion in today's money. The 2-month journey of Eisenhower's 1919 convoy could now be driven in about 5 days. The Engineering Society ranked the finished system alongside the Panama Canal and the Hoover Dam as one of the wonders of the century. What it did to America is bigger than the roads themselves. With fast highways linking every city of any size, people stopped needing to live near their work, and the suburbs exploded into communities built on the assumption that everyone would drive everywhere. Trucking overtook the railroads because goods could now move from a factory in one state to a store in another in a single day, door to door. The country's economy grew more than tenfold over the decades the system was built, and the highways are a large part of why. On the flip side, the same roads that connected the country tore through the middle of its cities, and the cost fell on the people least able to stop it. When planners routed the urban interstates, they ran them through established lower-middle-class neighborhoods. Highway construction in the 2 decades after 1956 displaced around 1 million people from their homes, and in many cities the roads were used deliberately to clear neighborhoods that had stood for generations. Some cities revolted and stopped the bulldozers. Planned freeways through San Francisco and New Orleans were killed by public anger, leaving stretches of highway that still end abruptly where the fight was won. For half a century, the interstate was the largest road network on Earth, the thing every other country measured itself against. It isn't anymore. Since 2000, China has built a national expressway system that has blown past it, well over 100,000 miles of high-speed highway, more than double the American network, constructed in a fraction of the time it took the United States. The road that built modern America is now aging, carrying far more traffic than it was designed for. Its mid-century bridges and interchanges wearing out all at once and costing billions a year just to hold together. While the record it set has already been broken on the other side of the world, the interstate connected one country. Just to the south, a far more ambitious idea had been building for decades. A single road that would connect 2 entire continents, from the top of the world to the bottom. Stretched end to end, the Pan-American Highway runs about 19,000 miles, from Prudhoe Bay on the frozen north coast of Alaska to the southern tip of Argentina in the last town before Antarctica. It passes through 14 countries, crosses deserts, rainforests, and some of the highest mountain passes on Earth, and it is recognized as the longest road in the world. You can, in theory, drive from one end of the Western Hemisphere to the other. The idea started as a railroad. In the 1880s, the United States floated a plan for an inter-American rail line running the length of both continents, but nothing was ever built. The concept resurfaced as a highway in the 1920s, and the countries of the Americas signed an agreement in 1937 to prioritize its completion, each nation responsible for building its own stretch. Mexico finished first in 1950 and was the only Latin American country to pay for its entire section itself. The others needed help, most of it from the United States. Washington's interest in the road stemmed from its military needs. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began building the highway through Central America in 1941 because of the Panama Canal. There was a war on, and no road connected the countries of Central America to the canal that the American military depended on. A land route to defend and supply the canal was worth building, and American money and engineers pushed the road south through the jungles and mountains of Central America toward it. The terrain the road crosses is relentless. Its highest point comes in Costa Rica, at a mountain pass called Cerro de la Muerte, or the Summit of Death. It is nearly 11,000 feet up and is named for the travelers who died crossing that stretch of highland in the years before the road made it survivable. Elsewhere, the highway threads between active volcanoes, runs along the spine of the Andes, and crosses the driest desert on Earth in northern Chile. By 1963, it was open for continuous traffic along almost its entire length. However, there is one gap, and even after 90 years, it has not been closed. Between Panama and Colombia, where North America meets South America, the road stops. It ends at a town called Yavisa on the Panama side, picks up again at Turbo in Colombia. In between lies roughly 60 miles of rainforest and swamp with no road across it. This is the Darien Gap, and it is the reason you cannot drive from Alaska to Argentina without putting your vehicle on a boat. The gap has resisted every attempt to bridge it because the engineering required to build it does not exist. On the Colombian side, the land dissolves into the delta of the Atrato River, a marshland 80 miles wide that doesn't so much block a road as swallow it. On the Panama side, the swamp gives way to mountainous rainforest, rising to peaks over 6,000 feet. It is some of the densest jungle on the continent, home to jaguars, venomous snakes, and indigenous peoples who have lived there for centuries and have consistently opposed a road that would carve through their land. Every attempt to build through the Darien has run into a wall of opposition. Environmentalists warn that a road would tear open one of the last untouched forests on Earth a place layered with nearly every conservation protection that exists. The Panamanian security establishment doesn't want a land route that smugglers and armed groups could use to move between the two countries. And the economics never worked either. The cost of building and maintaining a road through terrain like that has always been impossible to justify when ships and planes already carry the traffic. Ferry services meant to bypass the gap were tried and abandoned as unprofitable. Every institution with the power to build the road has a reason not to. So the gap remains roadless, but not empty. In the last decade, it has become one of the busiest and most dangerous migration routes in the world. A place considered impassable within living memory is now crossed on foot by hundreds of thousands of people a year, mostly migrants heading north toward the United States. In 2021, around 133,000 people crossed. In 2023, the number hit 520,000, the equivalent of over a tenth of Panama's entire population walking through a roadless jungle in a single year. The longest road on Earth is, and will likely remain, one gap short of complete. The Pan American had to cross the tropics at their most impenetrable. Far to the north, another country was trying to force a road across the opposite extreme. Thousands of miles of rock, forest, and some of the harshest winter on the planet. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and for most of its history, it had no continuous road access. The first man to drive across Canada in 1912 had to put his car on rail cars and boat decks to get through the wilderness north of Lake Superior because there was simply nothing to drive on. The country existed as a nation, but you couldn't traverse it on wheels. The Trans-Canada Highway was built to close those gaps. The federal and provincial governments struck a cost-sharing deal in the 1950s, aiming to connect the whole country by paved road in time for Canada's centennial in 1967. A single paved road running about 4,860 miles from Victoria on the Pacific to St. John's on the Atlantic, crossing all 10 provinces and 6 time zones. Construction ran across prairies, forests, mountains, and swamps, and 2 stretches in particular nearly broke the schedule. The first was along the north shore of Lake Superior between Sault Ste. Marie and Wawa in Ontario, a 165-mile gap through the Canadian Shield, a landscape of ancient exposed rock and dense forest with no roads, and in long stretches, no solid ground. This gap was full of waterlogged bog that in places ran 50 feet deep. You couldn't build a road on it because there was nothing underneath to hold the road up. The only way through was to fill the bog with rock until it hit bottom and stopped sinking, and the muskeg was deep enough that crews would dump tons of blast rock in and watch it disappear, the weight pressing the bottom of the bog down and forcing them to find still more rock to break the surface. Closing that one gap meant blasting over 2 million tons of rock, moving nearly 6 million cubic meters of earth, clearing 1,700 acres of forest, and building 25 new bridges. It opened in 1960. The second was Rogers Pass, high in the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia. The pass had a history the engineers knew well. The Canadian Pacific Railway had run its line through it in 1882 and abandoned that route in 1916, driving a tunnel underneath instead because the snow and avalanches had killed too many people. Rogers Pass gets around 30 feet of snow a year, and that snow sits on steep slopes until it breaks loose and comes down the mountain walls at speeds up to 325 kilometers an hour, fast enough to snap full-grown trees like matchsticks. Building an all-weather highway through a place that avalanches could bury 75 days a year was the hardest problem on the entire route. The solution was 2 layers of defense. The first was snow sheds, which are tunnel-like concrete roofs built over the road at the worst avalanche paths, so that when the snow comes down, it slides over the top of the highway and the traffic passes underneath, untouched. The second one is unlike almost anything else on a public road. The Canadian military stationed artillery in the pass. Avalanche forecasters study the snowpack constantly, and when it builds toward the point of breaking loose, howitzer gunners fire shells into the slopes above the highway to bring the avalanche down deliberately, with the road closed before it can come down on its own with cars underneath. It has run for more than 50 years and remains the largest mobile avalanche control program in the world. Rogers Pass opened in 1962, The whole route had taken about 20 years, and by the time the last gravel sections were paved and the project was formally finished in 1971, cost roughly $1.4 billion, the equivalent of close to $9 billion today. When it opened, it was the longest uninterrupted highway in the world. One of the first vehicles across the finished Rogers Pass section was a truck carrying 264 crates of fresh strawberries from British Columbia to buyers in Calgary. Before the highway, that fruit had to move by rail and took 3 days to arrive. By road, it was a single day. Multiply that across every kind of good and every route in the country, and a nation that had been stitched together by railways and steamships could suddenly move itself and everything it made by road coast to coast. Most of the original highway was, and much of it still is, just 2 lanes, one in each direction. For a road carrying a country's worth of traffic across mountains and through wilderness, it was built to a modest standard, and decades of work since have gone into widening the busiest stretches. But the achievement was never the width of the road. It was that there was a road at all, across a country most of which is rock, forest, and snow, and much of which had never had one. There is a saying in Guizhou that captures the whole problem of the place. There is not 3 feet of level ground in the entire province. More than 90% of it is mountains and hills. It is a landscape of deep gorges and karst peaks so folded and broken that 2 towns sitting a mile apart across a canyon could be half a day apart by road. The only way between them was to drive all the way down one side of the gorge and all the way back up the other. That terrain is beautiful enough that people call Guizhou the Switzerland of China, but for most of its history, it was what kept the province poor. You cannot run a business, ship your crops to market, or reach a hospital across a gorge that takes 2 hours to drive around. And so Guizhou stayed cut off while the rest of China grew rich. As recently as 2012, it was one of the poorest provinces in the country, with more than a quarter of its people living in poverty. The Chinese government's answer was to attack the geography directly, and it did so on a scale that has no equal anywhere in the world. Rather than routing roads around the mountains, engineers decided to carry the highways straight over the gorges on bridges, hundreds and then thousands of them, until the province became less a place with bridges than a place held together by them. Back in the 1980s, Guizhou had around 2,900 bridges. Today, it has more than 32,000, and nearly half of the 100 tallest bridges on the entire planet stand within this one province, earning it the nickname the World's Museum of Bridges. Nowhere else has anyone built structures this enormous, this high, this quickly. The scale of the individual bridges is difficult to hold in your head until you stand under one. The Doog Bridge, opened in 2016, carried a highway 565 meters above the Beipan River, high enough that the deck sat higher above the water than most skyscrapers stand above the street. And for years, it held the title of the highest bridge in the world. Then, in September 2025, Guizhou beat its own record with the Huajiang Grand Canyon Bridge, which strung a 4-lane highway 625 meters over the same river, higher than the Empire State Building stands above the pavement of Manhattan. The steel in it weighs about 22,000 tons, roughly the weight of 3 Eiffel Towers, and it was assembled in just under 4 years from more than 100,000 individual components, tested at the end by driving 96 loaded trucks across it to measure how the deck flexed under the weight. The crossing that used to take drivers 2 hours of white-knuckle switchbacks now takes about 2 minutes of driving across open air. Between 2012 and 2017, the government poured money into the province, increasing infrastructure spending by around 20% every year, and connected every county in Guizhou to the expressway network and every prefecture to high-speed rail. Government figures credit the transformation with lifting 6.7 million people out of poverty in 5 years, more than in any other Chinese province. The bridges have since become tourist attractions in their own right, drawing millions of visitors to glass walkways slung beneath the decks, and, on the newest bridge, what is billed as the highest bungee jump in the world. There is another side to all of this, and it sits underneath the concrete like a fault line, building tens of thousands of bridges across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth cost an astonishing amount of money, and Guizhou borrowed heavily to do it. By the end of 2022, the province was carrying around $388 billion in outstanding debt. One government-backed contractor responsible for the Doog Bridge was approaching $800 million a year just in interest payments. The plan was always to pay off the borrowing through tolls and the economic growth the roads would unlock, but the tolls and the growth have not come close to matching the avalanche of interest coming due. It is also why no other mountainous region on Earth is laced with dozens of record-breaking suspension bridges. The answer is that most places do the math first and conclude there are not enough vehicles to justify the cost. Guizhou built the bridges anyway, betting that the traffic and prosperity would follow the roads into the sky, and whether that bet pays off is a question the province is still waiting to answer. Guizhou built its roads to pull millions of people out of poverty. On the other side of the world, near the top of the planet, the United States built one of the most punishing roads it has ever attempted for a very different reason. There was oil at the end of it, and almost nothing else in between. In 1968, prospectors drilling into the frozen tundra of Alaska's North Slope struck the largest oil field ever discovered in North America, some 25 billion barrels of crude sitting under the Arctic coast at a place called Prudhoe Bay. It should have been one of the great strokes of fortune in American energy history, except for a single enormous problem. There was no way to get to it. Prudhoe Bay sat hundreds of miles from anything, walled off by mountains and endless tundra, with the nearest real town, Fairbanks, some 500 miles to the south, and not a single road connecting the two. The oil was there and no one could reach it. The pressure to solve that problem became a national emergency a few years later, when the OPEC oil embargo of the early 1970s sent fuel prices soaring and exposed how dangerously dependent the United States had become on oil from the Middle East. Suddenly, the crude locked under the North Slope was not just valuable, but strategically vital, and the plan to reach it took shape as one of the most ambitious construction efforts the country had ever attempted. An 800-mile pipeline running from the Arctic coast down to the ice-free port of Valdez in the south. But before a single length of pipe could be laid across that wilderness, the workers and their equipment needed a way to get there. They needed a road first. The road they built is the Dalton Highway, and the speed at which it went up is difficult to believe even now. Beginning at the end of April 1974, construction crews pushed a gravel highway roughly 390 miles north from the Yukon River toward Prudhoe Bay across terrain where no road had ever existed, and they finished it in about 5 months. Workers who were there described losing their grip on time entirely because in the Arctic summer, the sun never fully sets, and there was no way to tell whether it was the middle of the day or the middle of the night. The oil company spared almost no expense because every day the crude stayed in the ground was a day of sales lost, and the money that flowed to the workers, especially the truckers who hauled everything north, was extraordinary for the era. The terrain the road crosses is as hostile as anywhere a highway runs in North America. The hardest stretch is Atagun Pass, where the Dalton climbs to nearly 4,800 feet to cross the Brooks Range, the mountain wall that separates the Arctic coast from the rest of Alaska. It is the highest year-round mountain pass in the state. The grades are steep enough to rob heavy trucks of their traction, and avalanches come down onto it regularly, sometimes stranding drivers for days. Beyond the mountains, the road runs across a seemingly endless flat plain of tundra before ending abruptly a few miles short of the Arctic Ocean at a grim oil worker settlement called Dead Horse, where hotels ask guests to cover their work boots to keep the carpets clean. What makes driving it genuinely dangerous is the isolation as much as the weather. There are only 3 tiny settlements along the entire 414 miles, and across one 240-mile stretch, there is not a single gas station, restaurant, rest stop, or service of any kind. A driver who breaks down or slides off the road in a whiteout has no one to call and often no cell signal to call with, which is why truckers run CB radios. In winter, blowing snow can erase the road entirely, turning the tundra into a featureless white blank where the highway simply disappears. The road became famous to the wider world through the television show Ice Road Truckers, which billed it as a place where hell had frozen over. For all its brutality, the Dalton remains the only land connection between America's largest oil field and the rest of the country. Around 160 trucks a day run it in summer, and as many as 250 a day in winter, hauling the supplies that keep the North Slope oil operation alive. For all the success, the road now faces a major threat. The Arctic is warming, and the permafrost the highway was built on is beginning to thaw. Rivers that used to stay frozen now flood the roadbed, forcing weeks-long closures and repairs that run into the millions of dollars. In one stretch, a slow-moving mass of thawing earth, ice, and trees crept toward the highway at about 15 feet a year until the road had to be physically relocated to get out of its way. The ground the Dalton was carved into is no longer as solid or as permanent as it was in 1974, and keeping the Arctic lifeline open now means fighting the same frozen landscape that made it so hard to build in the first place, only this time as it melts. The Dalton was built to reach oil at the edge of the Arctic. Half a world away, another road took on terrain even more hostile than the frozen north, and the men who built it paid for every mile with their lives. The Karakoram Highway climbs through the single most violent piece of geology on the planet, a place where three of the world's great mountain ranges, the Himalaya, the Karakoram, and the Hindu Kush, crash into one another. It is where the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates are still actively colliding, shoving the mountains higher every year and shaking the ground with the earthquakes and landslides that come with a collision that is not yet finished. It runs about 800 miles from the plains of northern Pakistan up to the Chinese border and on toward the old Silk Road city of Kashgar, tracing one of the ancient caravan routes that carried silk and spices between east and west for 2,000 years. At its highest point, the Khunjerab Pass, the road crosses into China at nearly 15,400 feet, which makes it the highest paved international border crossing in the world. People call it the eighth wonder of the world, and given what it cost to build, the name is not an exaggeration. The two governments began the road in 1959, a joint project between Pakistan and China that would take 20 years to finish and open to the public in 1986. Around 24,000 workers labored on it, Pakistani soldiers from the Army's Engineering Corps working alongside Chinese crews, and the mountains fought them the entire way. Landslides, rockfalls, avalanches, and flash floods came down on the workers as they cut the road foot by foot into the sides of the gorges. One of the strangest hazards was the glaciers themselves, which moved unpredictably and reshaped the terrain the engineers were trying to build across. The human cost was staggering. Roughly 810 Pakistani workers and around 200 Chinese workers died building the highway, most of them killed in landslides or falls from the cliffs, and the road came to carry a grim nickname among the people who live along it. They call it the highway built on blood and bones. Many of the Chinese workers who died are buried in a cemetery in the town of Gilgit, far from home, in the mountains that killed them. Even the choice of where to put the road was shaped by conflict. Pakistan originally wanted to route the highway over a different pass, but in 1966, China pushed for the steeper Khunjerab Pass instead, arguing that the alternative sat too exposed and would be more vulnerable to airstrikes. The steeper, harder, higher route won, and the workers paid for that decision in the years of drilling and dying it took to conquer it. Finishing the road did not end the danger because the mountains never stopped moving. Landslides close sections of the highway every year. Monsoon rains in July and August wash parts of it away, and heavy snow shuts the high passes for months at a time. The most dramatic reminder of how fragile the road is came in January 2010, when a massive landslide crashed down into the Hunza Valley, burying a stretch of the highway and killing people in the villages below. The debris dammed the Hunza River completely, and behind that dam, the water rose into a new lake that had not existed before, eventually stretching more than 12 miles long and over 300 feet deep. The rising water swallowed miles of the highway, drowning the road under a lake that had appeared almost overnight, and for 5 years, there was no through road at all. Travelers had to load their vehicles onto small boats and ferry them across the water that now covered the route, past the tops of submerged trees and the rooftops of drowned buildings. It was not until 2015 that engineers finished a series of tunnels to carry the highway around the lake and reconnect the two ends of the road. Today, the Karakoram Highway has taken on an importance far beyond the traders and tourists who use it. It is the land spine of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a multi-billion-dollar network of roads, railways, and ports through which China is building a route from its western interior down to the Arabian Sea. And the old Friendship Road through the mountains has become the strategic artery connecting the two countries. China and Pakistan are now widening it, tripling its capacity, upgrading the road that thousands died to build into a modern trade corridor. For all its danger, it remains one of the most beautiful drives on Earth, winding beneath 7,000-meter peaks, past the turquoise water of the lake that buried it, up to the arch at the top of the world where Pakistan ends and China begins. From here, we move to yet another scenic yet deadly location, all the way in South America. In 1968, prospectors drilling into the frozen tundra of Alaska's North Slope struck the largest oil field ever discovered in North America, some 25 billion barrels of crude sitting under the Arctic coast at a place called Prudhoe Bay. It should have been one of the great strokes of fortune in American energy history, except for a single enormous problem. There was no way to get to it. Prudhoe Bay sat hundreds of miles from anything, walled off by mountains and endless tundra, with the nearest real town, Fairbanks, some 500 miles to the south, and not a single road connecting the two. The oil was there and no one could reach it. The pressure to solve that problem became a national emergency a few years later, when the OPEC oil embargo of the early 1970s sent fuel prices soaring and exposed how dangerously dependent the United States had become on oil from the Middle East. Suddenly, the crude locked under the North Slope was not just valuable, but strategically vital, and the plan to reach it took shape as one of the most ambitious construction efforts the country had ever attempted. An 800-mile pipeline running from the Arctic coast down to the ice-free port of Valdez in the south. But before a single length of pipe could be laid across that wilderness, the workers and their equipment needed a way to get there. They needed a road first. The road they built is the Dalton Highway, and the speed at which it went up is difficult to believe even now. Beginning at the end of April 1974, construction crews pushed a gravel highway roughly 390 miles north from the Yukon River toward Prudhoe Bay across terrain where no road had ever existed, and they finished it in about 5 months. Workers who were there described losing their grip on time entirely because in the Arctic summer, the sun never fully sets, and there was no way to tell whether it was the middle of the day or the middle of the night. The oil company spared almost no expense because every day the crude stayed in the ground was a day of sales lost, and the money that flowed to the workers, especially the truckers who hauled everything north, was extraordinary for the era. The terrain the road crosses is as hostile as anywhere a highway runs in North America. The hardest stretch is Atagun Pass, where the Dalton climbs to nearly 4,800 feet to cross the Brooks Range, the mountain wall that separates the Arctic coast from the rest of Alaska. It is the highest year-round mountain pass in the state. The grades are steep enough to rob heavy trucks of their traction, and avalanches come down onto it regularly, sometimes stranding drivers for days. Beyond the mountains, the road runs across a seemingly endless flat plain of tundra before ending abruptly a few miles short of the Arctic Ocean at a grim oil worker settlement called Deadhorse, where hotels ask guests to cover their work boots to keep the carpets clean. What makes driving it genuinely dangerous is the isolation as much as the weather. There are only 3 tiny settlements along the entire 414 miles, and across one 240-mile stretch, there is not a single gas station, restaurant, rest stop, or service of any kind. A driver who breaks down or slides off the road in a whiteout has no one to call and often no cell signal to call with, which is why truckers run CB radios. In winter, blowing snow can erase the road entirely, turning the tundra into a featureless white blank where the highway simply disappears. The road became famous to the wider world through the television show Ice Road Truckers, which billed it as a place where hell had frozen over. For all its brutality, the Dalton remains the only land connection between America's largest oil field and the rest of the country. Around 160 trucks a day run it in summer, and as many as 250 a day in winter, hauling the supplies that keep the North Slope oil operation alive. For all the success, the road now faces a major threat. The Arctic is warming, and the permafrost the highway was built on is beginning to thaw. Rivers that used to stay frozen now flood the roadbed, forcing weeks-long closures and repairs that run into the millions of dollars. In one stretch, a slow-moving mass of thawing earth, ice, and trees crept toward the highway at about 15 feet a year until the road had to be physically relocated to get out of its way. The ground the Dalton was carved into is no longer as solid or as permanent as it was in 1974, and keeping the Arctic lifeline open now means fighting the same frozen landscape that made it so hard to build in the first place, only this time as it melts. The Dalton was built to reach oil at the edge of the Arctic. Half a world away, another road took on terrain even more hostile than the frozen north, and the men who built it paid for every mile with their lives. In western China, a vast wall of snow and rock that splits the region cleanly in two. For as long as anyone has lived there, that wall has separated the north of Xinjiang from the south, and crossing it meant a long, dangerous drive over high mountain passes that climbed above 13,000 feet and froze shut for 6 to 8 months of the year. The mountains were simply in the way, and for centuries there was nothing to be done about it. China's answer, finished at the end of 2025, was to drive a road straight through the heart of the range. The Tianshan-Shengli Tunnel runs 14 miles beneath the mountains, and when it opened on December 26, 2025, it became the longest expressway tunnel in the world. What used to be a treacherous, hours-long climb over the most dangerous stretch of the Tianshan crossing became a 20-minute drive through the mountain at 60 miles an hour. The tunnel cut the trip between the northern capital of Urumqi and the southern city of Korla from around 7 hours to about 3. Building it meant fighting the mountain on every front at once. The tunnel sits buried at more than 3,000 feet beneath the ridge above it, under so much rock that the ground itself is under enormous pressure. The crews worked at altitudes above 10,000 feet, in a place where the average temperature stays below freezing and winter lows reach minus 40 degrees. Worst of all, the route had to cut across 16 separate geological fault zones, where a tunnel is at its most vulnerable to collapse. High pressure, hard cold, thin air, earthquakes, and broken rock, all of it standing between the engineers and the finished tunnel. The way they solved the problem was as clever as the tunnel is long. A tunnel of that length, dug the ordinary way from both ends toward the middle, would have taken around 10 years to complete. Instead, the engineers bored a smaller service tunnel down the center of the route first, and then used that central tunnel to open up additional work faces along the length of the mountain, so that instead of digging from just two ends, crews could attack the rock from many points at once. 2 enormous custom-built boring machines, each about 900 feet long and weighing around 2,000 tons, ground through the rock. The long tunnel short sections approach cut the construction time from a decade to just over 4 years, a first for a tunnel of this scale in China. Along the way, they set a second world record for the deepest vertical shaft ever sunk for a highway tunnel, dropping more than 2,200 feet straight down into the core of the range. For all the engineering, the tunnel had one more problem to solve, and it was a human one. Driving for 20 minutes through an unbroken concrete tube can put a driver into a kind of trance, a well-known danger called tunnel hypnosis. The sameness of the walls and the lighting lulls the mind and attention drifts. To fight it, The engineers lit sections of the ceiling with patterns of blue sky and clouds, breaking up the monotony to keep drivers alert, and ran full mobile coverage and emergency phones every 200 meters along the length of the tube. The tunnel cost around $3.8 billion, and it is the centerpiece of a much larger expressway pushing across Xinjiang. It opened an all-weather corridor for coal, energy, and fresh produce to move between the north and south of the region in half a day along a route that heavy snow used to close for much of the year. It is one more piece of China's push to bind its far western frontier to the rest of the country and beyond. China drove its road through the mountain to connect two halves of a region. In the high Himalayas of northern India, another tunnel was built through a mountain for a reason that was as much military as it was civilian. To reach a valley that spent half of every year completely cut off from the rest of the country, and to put the army within reach of a contested border. High in the Indian Himalayas, north of the hill town of Manali, sits the Rohtang Pass, a gateway through the mountains at around 13,000 feet that was for centuries the only way into the valleys beyond. It was also, for roughly 6 months of every year, completely impassable. When the winter snow came, the pass closed entirely, and the people living on the far side were sealed off from the rest of the country until spring. They stockpiled supplies and waited out the winter cut off from the world. The pass itself was dangerous even when open, notorious for sudden snowstorms, landslides, and the deaths that came with them. The idea of tunneling underneath Rohtang had been floating around since the 1860s, but it was not until 2000 that it was declared that the tunnel would finally be built. Even then, it took a decade of studies and preparation before the first blast in 2010. What the engineers set out to build was a 9-kilometer tunnel bored straight through the Pir Panjal Range, running at around 10,000 feet, which made it the longest highway tunnel in the world at that altitude. The plan was to dig from both ends toward the middle, the standard approach, except that the north end of the tunnel sat on the far side of the Rohtang Pass, which meant that for 6 months of every winter, the crews simply could not reach it. So for much of the year, all the work had to come from the southern end alone, and in the end, only about a quarter of the tunnel was dug from the north and the remaining 3/4 from the south. Then, the mountain produced the challenge that nearly killed the whole project. About 600 meters in from the southern entrance, the tunnel hit something called the Siri Nala Fault Zone, a seam of shattered, pulverized rock that turned out to be far worse than anyone imagined. The rock in the fault was so broken and waterlogged that as the crews dug into it, water came pouring into the tunnel at up to 2,000 gallons, and the tunnel roof kept collapsing. Progress, which had been running at about 120 meters a month, crashed to just 20 meters a month. The problem was so severe that the engineers seriously considered abandoning the planned route entirely and rerouting the tunnel. Conquering that single stretch of bad rock took nearly 4 years of constant flooding, collapses, and dewatering before they finally pushed through it. The project ran years past its original schedule, and its cost climbed from the initial estimate of around 5 billion rupees to somewhere between 32 and 35 billion by the time it was done, a more than 6-fold increase. But in October 2020, it opened, and remarkably, after 10 years of digging through some of the most treacherous geology in the Himalayas, it was completed without a single worker dying on the job, and it revolutionized travel immediately. The old route over the Rohtang Pass ran 70 miles and took 5 to 6 hours in good conditions. The Atal Tunnel cut that to 44 miles and to less than 2 hours. More importantly, it stayed open through the winter, giving the 20,000 people of the Lahaul Valley a road to the outside world for the first time. Tourists poured into the newly accessible valleys, and the local economy grew quickly. But the tunnel was never only about tourism or the villages, and this is the other half of why India built it. The road it sits on leads toward Ladakh and the contested, militarized border with China high in the mountains beyond. For the Indian Army, a route that stayed open all winter meant that troops and supplies could reach that frontier year-round, instead of being cut off every time the snow closed the passes. Now we move to yet another tunnel in Virginia that bypassed a wall of water. At the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, where the largest estuary in the United States meets the open Atlantic, the land on either side comes tantalizingly close but never quite connects. For centuries, the water was a wall. To get from the Norfolk and Virginia Beach area on the mainland to the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula on the far shore, you either drove the long way around the top of the bay or, from the 1930s on, you waited for a ferry to carry you across. The ferries grew more and more crowded as the region filled in, and it became obvious that what the crossing really needed was a fixed link straight across the mouth of the bay. The problem was that the mouth of the bay is about 18 miles of open water exposed to Atlantic storms, and it carries some of the busiest shipping lanes on the East Coast, including the approaches to the Great Port of Baltimore and the Navy's main Atlantic bases. A continuous bridge 18 miles long across those shipping channels created an unacceptable risk. If a ship ever struck it and brought a span down, the wreckage would block the channel and choke off both commercial shipping and the Navy's access. So the engineers proposed something stranger and more ingenious. The road would run across the bay on low bridges for most of its length, but at the two main shipping channels, it would dive underwater, dropping into mile-long tunnels that ran beneath the ships passing overhead, then climbing back up to the surface on the far side to continue as a bridge. Making that work required building islands in the open sea. At each point where the road transitioned between bridge and tunnel, the crews constructed an artificial island out of millions of tons of sand and rock, sunk into 35 to 45 feet of water. Each island was about 1,500 feet long and served as the portal where the roadway left the bridge and entered the tunnel. 4 of these man-made islands were built from nothing, rising out of the bay to anchor the 2 tunnels. The tunnels themselves were assembled from huge steel and concrete tube sections, 37 feet across and 300 feet long, floated out on the water, sunk into a trench dredged in the seabed, joined together end to end, and buried under sand and rock to hold them in place. The whole 18-mile crossing, built across open water without satellite navigation, ended up with a total alignment error of less than half an inch. The way the project was paid for was as bold as the engineering. The state put in no money at all. Instead, the commission behind it sold $200 million in bonds to private investors in 1960, a sum equal to well over $1.5 billion today, promising to pay them back entirely out of the tolls collected from drivers. No local, state, or federal tax money went into it. Plenty of people thought the whole idea was reckless. Critics called the bridge tunnel extravagant and dangerous, warning that storms or a ship straying off course could wreck it and that there might not even be enough traffic to cover the debt. The sea fought the construction the entire way. The crossing was built out in the open water with the Atlantic on one side and the bay on the other, exposed to nor'easters and hurricanes. During the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962, much of the partly finished work was destroyed along with a massive custom-built pile driver, a barge the crews had nicknamed the Big D. 7 workers were killed at various points during construction, and they are memorialized at the southern end of the crossing today. In April 1964, just 42 months after construction began, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel opened, and the ferries shut down for good. It was quickly voted one of the 7 engineering wonders of the modern world in an international competition against more than 100 major projects. What the doubters had called reckless turned out to be a success, carrying U.S. Route 13 across the mouth of the bay and cutting roughly 95 miles and an hour and a half off the trip up the coast. By the 2020s, it had carried well over 140 million vehicles, and it had been expanded with double the bridges and a second tunnel. The Chesapeake crossing succeeded against the doubters who said it could not pay for itself. In the Amazon, a country attempted something far larger and far more reckless, a road to conquer the largest rainforest on the planet, and the jungle proved the doubters right. In the late 1960s, Brazil's military government looked at a map of the Amazon and saw a problem. Nearly half the country's territory was covered by dense rainforest, but very few people lived there. To the generals in Brasilia, an empty Amazon wasn't just wasted potential, it was a national security risk. They feared that if Brazil didn't occupy its vast interior, someone else eventually would. So they came up with an audacious plan, carve a highway straight through the largest rainforest on Earth. It would bring settlers, farms, mines, and entire new towns into a region that had remained largely untouched for centuries. It was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects ever attempted, but almost as soon as construction began, it became clear that the Amazon wasn't going to be conquered so easily. The plan was staggering in scale. The Trans-Amazonian Highway was designed to run nearly 5,000 kilometers from the Atlantic coast in the east all the way across the width of the Amazon basin to the border with Peru, cutting straight through the Amazon. The government intended to settle 100,000 landless families along its route, handing them plots carved out of the forest, and in doing so to plant a permanent Brazilian presence in the region. It was announced in 1970 and construction began almost immediately, driving west into the jungle. The forest fought back in ways the planners had not reckoned with. The soils of the Amazon, which look as though they should be fertile because they support such an immense forest, are in fact thin and poor. When settlers cleared their plots and planted crops, the exposed soil gave out within a season or two and had to be abandoned, forcing them to clear yet more forest every year just to keep growing anything. Harvests were miserable. The heavy rains turned the roadbed into deep mud that swallowed trucks and cut the road for weeks at a time. Many of the colonists, lured in with easy credit they did not understand, sank into debt. The Great Settlement Scheme collapsed within a decade. The road never reached Peru. The eastern third of it, nearest the coast, was paved and became a busy, functioning highway. But as it pushed west into the deep forest, it degraded into a single-lane dirt track that turns to impassable mud every rainy season. And in the far west, it simply gave out in country. The road never truly opened. The Peruvian border still lying under intact rainforest, the highway never managed to reach. More than 50 years after construction began, long stretches of it remain unpaved and seasonally impassable, and the original forest along much of its length is gone. The human cost fell heaviest on people who never asked for the road at all. The highway drove straight through the territories of indigenous peoples who had lived in the forest for millennia and who had no defenses against the diseases the road brought in with the settlers and work crews. Independent estimates put the number of indigenous deaths from that contact at around 8,000, with thousands of workers also buried in unmarked graves along the roadbed. A road built to relieve one group's suffering created a far greater catastrophe for another, and the road kept doing damage long after it failed at its original purpose. What the Trans-Amazonian became, more than anything else, was a way into the forest for everyone who came after the settlers, the cattle ranchers, the loggers, the gold miners. Satellite images of the highway show a distinctive pattern the researchers call a fishbone, a central spine of road with clearings radiating off it at right angles, each one eating further into the trees, spreading out from the highway like something growing. After the road went in, Brazilian deforestation accelerated to levels never seen before, and the Trans-Amazonian became the spine of what has been called the largest deforestation event in human history. The road failed to settle the poor, failed to reach Peru, and failed to become the continuous highway it was meant to be. The one thing it succeeded at was opening the rainforest to destruction, and at that it has never stopped. The Amazon defeated Brazil's road with mud and poor soil. On the far side of the world, on the highest plateau on Earth, China set out to build a road across an obstacle that was in some ways even more hostile. A frozen highland so high and so cold that the very ground it was built on refused to stay solid. For most of history, Tibet was almost impossible to reach. The Tibetan Plateau sits higher than anywhere else people live in large numbers. A vast cold highland averaging above 4,000 meters, ringed by the tallest mountains on Earth, and getting anything in or out of it meant long, brutal journeys on the backs of men and pack animals over rugged mountain paths. A single round trip to bring supplies from the Chinese interior could take a year, When the newly established People's Republic of China moved to consolidate its control over Tibet in the early 1950s, it ran straight into that problem. There was no way to move troops or goods across the plateau at any useful speed, and so the government decided to build a road up onto the roof of the world. Construction of the Qinghai-Tibet Highway began in 1954, pushing nearly 2,000 kilometers from the city of Xining across the plateau to Lhasa. The numbers describing where it runs are almost hard to believe. The road climbs to its highest point at the Tanggula Pass at 5,231 meters, which makes it the highest asphalt road anywhere in the world. Roughly 980 kilometers of it sit above 4,500 meters, in air so thin that it holds only about half the oxygen available at sea level, where simply standing still leaves a person breathless and hard physical labor becomes punishing. The road was carved across this frozen highland alongside its sister project, the Sichuan-Tibet Highway, and the two together were built at a terrible price. More than 3,000 people died constructing them, worn down by the altitude, the cold, and the sheer difficulty of building anything in a place so hostile to human beings. The single greatest engineering problem was not the height or the cold directly, but what they did to the ground. About 630 kilometers of the highway is built over permafrost, soil that stays frozen year-round, and permafrost is a treacherous thing to build a road on. As the seasons and temperatures shift, the frozen ground expands and contracts, heaving and sinking beneath whatever sits on top of it, buckling and cracking a road surface laid over it. The intense solar radiation at that altitude and the wide temperature swings between day and night only made the problem worse, constantly working to break the pavement apart. Keeping a stable road over ground that refused to stay still became a permanent battle, one that has driven decades of research into how to build and maintain roads on frozen earth, using techniques like embankments designed to keep the ground below them frozen and prevent it from thawing and collapsing under the road. Since it opened in 1954 and was later paved, the government has spent enormous sums on major overhauls just to keep it functioning against the permafrost that constantly works to destroy it. But for all the difficulty of maintaining it, the road did exactly what it was built to do. It ended Tibet's reliance on men and pack animals to move goods, and it remains the region's essential supply line to this day. Even now, with a high-altitude railway running alongside part of its route, the Qinghai-Tibet Highway still carries around 85% of all the goods moving in and out of Tibet, which has earned it the name the Lifeline of Tibet. Most people traveling to Lhasa now take the train, but the food, fuel, and supplies that keep the plateau's cities alive still come up the highway, along the road that thousands died to build across the highest, coldest, thinnest-aired ground that any paved road in the world crosses. The Qinghai-Tibet Road fights an enemy that never lets up, the frozen ground beneath it. On the storm-battered coast of Norway, a very different road picks a fight with the sea itself, on a stretch of water so exposed that the waves wash straight over the pavement. On the western coast of Norway, where the land breaks apart into a scatter of low, rocky islands and the open North Atlantic presses in against the shore, there is a short stretch of road that looks less like infrastructure than like something out of a dream. The Atlantic Road runs only about 8 kilometers, but in that short distance, it hops from island to island across open ocean on a chain of 8 bridges, curving and dipping over the water, and on the most famous of them, the Storseisundet Bridge, the road twists up and over so steeply that from certain angles it appears to stop in midair, launching cars off the end into the sky or the sea. It is an optical illusion, the curves simply following the line of the islands, but it has made the bridge one of the most photographed structures in Europe. The road exists to solve an ordinary problem in an extraordinary place. The small communities on these islands had for generations depended on ferries to reach the mainland, ferries that were slow, tied to a schedule, and at the mercy of the same weather that batters this coast. The idea of a fixed link across the islands went back to 1935, when it was first imagined as a railway, but that plan never came to anything, and it was not until the 1970s that serious planning began for a road. Construction finally started in 1983. Building it meant working out in the open sea on one of the most exposed coastlines in Norway. directly in the path of the storms that sweep in off the North Atlantic. The location is so battered by weather that over the 6 years of construction, the crews were hit by 12 separate hurricanes. Storms regularly halted the work for days or weeks at a stretch, and the enormous waves destroyed equipment and damaged the parts of the structure that were already built. The exposure meant the crews could only work in the narrow windows of calm weather between storms, pouring concrete during the quiet spells, and sometimes abandoning the site entirely as the next storm bore down on them. The bridges themselves had to be built without any support from below because the deep, wave-lashed water made it impossible to erect scaffolding up from the seabed. Instead, the crews used a cantilever method, building each bridge outward from its piers in matched segments that counterbalanced each other, the two arms of the bridge growing out over the water until they met in the middle. The concrete had to be specially formulated to survive decades of constant salt spray and the relentless freezing and thawing of the Norwegian coast, and divers worked on the underwater foundations in dangerous currents and poor visibility. The finished road opened in July 1989, having cost 122 million Norwegian kroner, and it immediately replaced the ferries that had served the islands for generations. To pay for it, drivers were charged a toll, expected to run for 15 years. But so many people came to drive the road, tourists as much as locals, that the construction cost was paid off in just 10 years, and the toll was removed in 1999. What the engineers had built as a practical link turned out to be one of the most spectacular drives in the world. Norwegians voted it the Norwegian construction of the century, and it was preserved as a cultural heritage site and made one of the country's official national tourist routes. Car manufacturers filmed their commercials on it, often deliberately during storms when the waves break clean over the road and the bridges. And that danger is real, not staged. In heavy weather, the sea still washes across the pavement, and the road has to be closed for safety when the storms come in off the Atlantic, exactly as they did on the crews who spent 6 years building a road across the open sea. Norway built its road out across the water, in plain sight. In Hawaii, the challenge was the opposite. To cross the spine of a Pacific island, engineers had to carve a highway through mountains so steep and so sacred that the road became the most expensive stretch of interstate in American history, and one of the most bitterly fought. There is a stretch of interstate on the Hawaiian island of Oahu that may be the most beautiful road in the United States. It cuts straight through the Ko'olau Range, the jagged green wall of mountains that runs down the spine of the island, threading through tunnels bored into the lava rock and soaring across deep valleys on long viaducts perched high above the tree line. When drivers come out of the eastern end of the tunnels, the whole windward side of the island opens up in front of them, the cliffs and the water of Kainohi Bay laid out below, and it is genuinely hard to keep your eyes on the road. It is also one of the most controversial and most expensive stretches of highway ever built in America, and to many native Hawaiians, it is a wound that has never healed. The road, officially Interstate H3, was born out of the Cold War. When Hawaii became a state in 1959, Congress added its highways to the National Interstate and Defense System the following year, which qualified them for federal money that covered 90% of the cost. H3 was conceived as a military route, a fast connection across the island between the Great Naval Base at Pearl Harbor on one coast and the Marine Corps Base at Kainohi on the other, at a time when the fear of conflict in Southeast Asia made a quick way to move the military across the island seem urgent. The initial estimate to build it was around $250 million. Almost nothing about it went as planned. Orders for the freeway came in 1960, but it would not open for 37 years. The first great obstacle was environmental law. A 1970 federal act required a full environmental impact study for a project like this, and that requirement, combined with a wave of lawsuits, brought the road to a standstill. Environmentalists and native Hawaiians came together to fight it because the highway would tear through the island's forests, some of them home to endangered native birds, and because its original route ran through the Moanalua Valley, an area of deep spiritual and historical significance to native Hawaiians, dotted with the remains of sacred temples and burial sites. For years, the opposition won. In 1976, a federal court protected the Maunalua Valley on the grounds of its cultural importance, and the state was forced to abandon the original route entirely. But that victory carried a bitter consequence. The road was simply diverted into the neighboring Halawa Valley, and that valley turned out to be even more sacred than the one that had been saved. The years of study produced a stack of environmental paperwork 4 feet high, and the road still could not get built. By the mid-1980s, after the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a ruling that the state had failed to properly consider alternative routes, the whole project seemed like it might finally be dead. What saved it was raw political power. Hawaii's U.S. Senator Daniel Inouye, a powerful figure in Washington and a fierce supporter of the highway, pushed a measure through Congress in 1986 that exempted H3 from most of the environmental laws that were blocking it. Attached to a defense budget bill and signed by President Reagan, the exemption wiped out the opposition's hard-won court victories in a single stroke, and the injunctions were lifted. Critics took to calling the road Danny's Highway. Large-scale construction finally resumed, and the road ground forward through the Sacred Valley. The conflict only intensified as the digging revealed what was there. Archaeologists identified temple complexes of immense religious importance along the route. In 1992, an archaeologist at the Bishop Museum, which had been hired to do the historical research, publicly accused the museum of downplaying the significance of what had been found in order to keep the road moving, and he was fired, later settling a whistleblower lawsuit. Native Hawaiian women began occupying the valley at the site of what was believed to be a women's temple. The state spent $10 million rerouting the freeway into an S-curve to avoid 2 of the most sacred sites, though the archaeologist who exposed the cover-up believes the realignment cut straight through the middle of the complex and destroyed it anyway. On the Kainohe side, a temple believed by some scholars to have been one of the largest on the island, dedicated to the Hawaiian god of agriculture, was destroyed during construction and now lies buried under tons of concrete. As one Hawaiian studies professor put it, every time someone drives over that spot, they are driving over the bones buried at the temple. The road finally opened on December 12, 1997. By then, it had taken 37 years to complete and cost about $1.3 billion, roughly $1 billion over its original budget, and around $80 million for every one of its 16 miles, which made it one of the most expensive stretches of interstate ever built on a per-mile basis and the largest public works project in Hawaii's history. And the Cold War purpose it had been built for had largely evaporated. The urgency that justified it in 1960 was long gone by the time it opened. Today, it stands as a road of contradictions. It is celebrated as one of the most spectacular drives in the country, a genuine engineering achievement, its viaducts and tunnels framing some of the most beautiful scenery in Hawaii. And it is condemned as a scar on the island and its history, a highway that many native Hawaiians consider cursed for the sacred ground it destroyed, built over the objections of the people whose ancestors were buried in its path, connecting 2 military bases across an island for a war that never came. H3 fought for decades over what a road would destroy on the surface. In Norway, engineers went the other way entirely, burying the world's longest road tunnel deep under the mountains, and in doing so, they ran into a problem that had nothing to do with rock and everything to do with the human mind. Norway is a country carved up by mountains and fjords, and connecting its 2 largest cities, Oslo and Bergen, had always meant a hard journey. The route across the mountains between them was subject to rockfalls and snow, dangerous in winter, and in places, it depended on ferries to carry cars across the water. The Norwegian government wanted a highway that would link the 2 cities reliably all year round, without ferries and without the treacherous mountain crossings. And the missing piece of that highway was a stretch through a mountain range in the west of the country. Rather than build a road over or around the mountains, where rockfalls made any route risky and where construction would scar the untouched landscape, the government decided in 1992 to go straight through with a tunnel. The tunnel they built is the Lærdal Tunnel, and at 24.5 kilometers, it is the longest road tunnel in the world. Construction ran from 1995 to 2000, blasting through 2.5 million cubic meters of solid rock, with crews drilling from both ends and from an intermediate access point to speed the work. It cost around $113 million, and when it opened in November 2000, it took the world record from a tunnel in Switzerland by a margin of about 5 miles. Driving its full length takes about 20 minutes at the speed limit, but the length that made it a record also created a problem the engineers had never really had to face before, and it was not a problem of rock or ventilation. It was a problem of the human mind. 20 minutes of driving through an unbroken tube of stone, with nothing to look at but gray walls sliding past in the same yellow light, does something to a driver. The monotony dulls the attention and lulls people toward sleep, and for some, the sheer enclosure of being sealed inside a mountain for 15 miles can bring on claustrophobia and disorientation. A tunnel that long, badly designed would not just be unpleasant, it would be dangerous, full of drowsy, anxious drivers losing their focus. So the Norwegian Road Authority did something unusual for a construction project. It brought in a team of psychologists. Working alongside the engineers, researchers studied how the human mind responds to a long drive underground and designed the tunnel's interior specifically to keep drivers alert and calm. They broke the single 24-kilometer tube into 4 sections by hollowing out 3 enormous caverns along its length, spaced about 6 kilometers apart, each one roughly the size of a large hall. As a driver comes out of the dark, narrow main tunnel into one of these caverns, the space suddenly opens up and the lighting changes completely. Where the main tunnel is lit white, the caverns are washed in blue light with a fringe of yellow around the edges, deliberately designed to mimic the look of a sunrise breaking over a horizon. The effect gives the driver something to look at, a sense of having reached a landmark and made progress, and a place to pull over and rest if needed, breaking the hypnotic sameness of the drive into manageable stretches. Beyond the caverns, the engineers laid the tunnel out with gentle curves rather than long, dead-straight runs, because a subtly bending road demands more of a driver's attention than an endless straight line, and they added rumble strips to jolt awake anyone drifting off. The tunnel broke new ground in another way as well. It was the first in the world to have its own dedicated air treatment plant, housed in its own chamber, using huge fans and filters to strip the dust and the nitrogen dioxide from the exhaust out of the air, keeping it breathable across the whole 15-mile length. The result is a piece of infrastructure that people describe less as a tunnel than as an experience, an otherworldly drive through the dark, punctuated by glowing blue caverns that feel like emerging into a false dawn deep inside a mountain. It became a tourist attraction in its own right, folded into itineraries of Norway's fjords, and it became a model that other countries studied when they set out to build their own long tunnels, a demonstration that the hardest problem in building a road 15 miles into a mountain was not conquering the rock, but keeping the minds of the people driving through it awake and calm. The Qinghai-Tibet Road and the Tian Shan Tunnel each conquered a single obstacle. In the far west of China, there is a road that had to conquer all of them at once, threading a single highway through deserts, glaciers, canyons, and one of the most forbidding mountain ranges on Earth. To understand why this road is so difficult, you have to picture the shape of Xinjiang, the enormous region that makes up China's far northwest. Seen from above, it is a landscape of extremes stacked on top of one another. 3 great mountain ranges run across it, the Altai in the north, the Tian Shan through the middle, and the Kunlun in the south. And between those ranges sit 2 vast basins, each one filled with a desert. The northern basin holds the Gurbantungut, and the southern one holds the Taklamakan, one of the largest and most hostile sand deserts on the planet. For thousands of years, the people of Xinjiang have picked their way around these mountains and deserts on ancient caravan tracks because the Tian Shan Range in the middle formed a wall that split the region cleanly into a northern half and a southern half, with no fast way across. The Urumqi-Uli Expressway was built to punch straight through that wall. It runs about 325 kilometers from Urumqi, the regional capital in the north, down to Uli County in the south. and it opened at the end of December 2025 after 5 years of construction and an investment of around $6.6 billion. Before it existed, getting from the northern city of Urumqi to the southern city of Korla meant a drive of around 7 hours over winding mountain roads that climbed above 4,000 meters and were regularly closed by snow and ice in winter, or a long detour around the range. The new expressway cut that journey to about 3 hours and made it possible to drive in any season. The centerpiece of the road is the Tianshan-Shengli Tunnel, the world's longest expressway tunnel, which carries the highway 22 kilometers straight through the heart of the mountains. But the tunnel is only one part of the challenge, because the terrain the road crosses changes constantly along its length. The expressway runs through glaciers, high grasslands, forested valleys, stretches of Gobi Desert, and wetlands, each with its own demands. And in one stretch of just 11 kilometers, the ground is so broken and mountainous that the engineers had to carry the road on 14 bridges and through 5 tunnels, meaning that in that section, the highway is almost never actually touching solid open ground. It is either flying across a gap on a bridge or buried inside a mountain in a tunnel for more than 90% of its length. Part of the route ran through a problem that had nothing to do with engineering. A 116-kilometer section of the expressway passes through an area unusually rich in wildlife, home to a notable concentration of protected animals. And to get the road through it without carving up the habitat, the builders put in 17 tunnels and 36 large bridges along that stretch alone, letting the road pass over and under the landscape while leaving the ground and the animals' movements largely undisturbed beneath it. What the road does for the region goes well beyond the time it saves drivers. Xinjiang produces enormous quantities of cotton, energy, and raw materials. And for the industries of the South, getting those goods to the rest of China had always meant slow, weather-dependent journeys around the mountains. A textile company manager in the South explained what the expressway changed for him in plain terms. Moving raw materials down from the north of Xinjiang used to take 3 to 4 days, and now it takes 1 to 2. The road plugs directly into China's wider expressway network, linking the far western frontier all the way through to the manufacturing heartlands of the east and beyond them to the trade corridors reaching into Central Asia. It is a piece of a much larger effort to bind Xinjiang, a core region on the old Silk Road, more tightly to the rest of the country, built by driving a modern highway through mountains, deserts, and glaciers that had kept the region divided for as long as people had lived there. China built its Western Expressway across a landscape of deserts and mountains. In the waters of southern China, engineers took on a different kind of frontier entirely, the open sea, building a road so long across the ocean that it dwarfed anything of its kind ever attempted. The Pearl River Delta in southern China is one of the most economically powerful stretches of land in the world, a dense cluster of cities that includes Hong Kong, Macau, and the mainland manufacturing hubs around them. But the mouth of the Pearl River sat like a moat between them. Hong Kong and Macau face each other across a wide expanse of open water, and for decades getting from one side to the other meant a ferry across the estuary, or a long drive of several hours around the top of the bay. To knit these cities into a single connected region, China decided to build a road straight across the water, and the result is the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, the longest sea crossing on Earth. The scale of it is difficult to overstate. The full system runs about 55 kilometers across the Pearl River estuary, a combination of bridges and tunnel that cost around $18.8 billion and took nearly 9 years to build, opening in October 2018. The main structure carries a 6-lane highway on a series of cable-stayed bridges. And to build it, the engineers used a quantity of material that beggars belief. Enough steel to build 60 Eiffel Towers and enough concrete for 22 Chrysler buildings, all of it engineered to survive the super typhoons and powerful earthquakes that strike the region. For a driver, it turned a journey of around 3 hours into one of about 30 minutes. The most ingenious part of the crossing lies in the middle, where the bridge does something unexpected. The Pearl River estuary carries some of the busiest shipping traffic in the world. The sea lane lanes into the major ports of the region, and it sits right next to Hong Kong International Airport, where a tall bridge would have interfered with the flight paths of landing aircraft. A continuous high bridge was therefore impossible across that stretch. So instead, at the point where it needed to let both ships and planes pass, the road dives underwater. It descends onto an artificial island, runs for nearly 7 kilometers through an immersed tunnel laid in a trench on the seabed up to 40 meters below the surface, and then climbs back out onto a second artificial island to continue as a bridge on the far side. The two islands were built from nothing in the open sea to serve as the doorways where the road transitions between bridge and tunnel, and the tunnel itself is the longest immersed road tunnel in the world. For all its ambition, the bridge was built at a heavy human and financial cost, and it has never fully escaped the controversy that surrounded it. The construction killed at least 19 workers and injured more than 600, a toll that a government investigation examined, but that authorities were slow to make public. The project ran years behind schedule and far over its original budget, and it was dogged by accusations of shoddy work, including reports that concrete test results had been falsified and that the enormous concrete blocks meant to protect the artificial islands from the waves had drifted out of place, raising questions about whether the islands and the tunnel beneath them were structurally sound. The authorities dismissed the concerns, insisting the blocks were designed to be scattered, but drone footage showing sections of the protective barrier underwater kept the doubts alive. Conservationists blamed the construction for a sharp decline in the population of the rare Chinese white dolphins that lived in those waters, with numbers near the bridge dropping steeply during the building. And then, once it opened, the traffic did not come. To drive across the bridge, private cars need special permits that are tightly controlled, and the volume of vehicles using the crossing came in far below what had been projected, leaving the most expensive sea crossing ever built strangely quiet for long stretches. It stands as a genuine engineering marvel and a symbol of China's ambition to fuse its southern cities into a single economic region, and at the same time as a monument to what that ambition cost in money, in lives, and in a bridge built for far more traffic than has ever actually used it. In the 1950s, Boston did what many American cities did in that era. It ran an elevated highway straight through the middle of downtown, a raised expressway called the Central Artery, carrying Interstate 93 on green steel legs above the streets. It was meant to solve the city's traffic, and for a while it did. But it also walled off the historic waterfront and the North End neighborhood from the rest of the city, casting the streets below into shadow and choking on traffic it was never designed to handle. By the 1980s, it was carrying far more cars than it was built for, jammed for hours a day, and the city wanted it gone. The plan they landed on was audacious. They would build a new, larger highway in a tunnel directly underneath the elevated one, keep the old highway running the entire time, and then, once the tunnel was open and carrying traffic, tear the elevated road down. The city would get its highway and its surface back at the same time. The project became known as the Big Dig, officially the Central Artery Tunnel Project, and it was the largest and most expensive highway project in American history. Getting it approved took 16 years of political struggle, and it was even vetoed by President Reagan before Congress overrode him, and it broke ground in 1991. The engineering problems it had to solve were unprecedented, hardest of which was building a wide tunnel underneath a narrow elevated highway without letting that highway collapse while traffic still crawled along it overhead. The engineers solved it by building horizontal braces as wide as the new tunnel, then cutting away the old highway's original support struts and gently lowering the elevated road onto the new braces, all while cars drove along above, their drivers with no idea of the work going on beneath their wheels. The tunnel also had to pass under a tangle of subway lines, railroads, and a century of forgotten pipes and utilities buried under the city, and in places the ground was too soft and wet to dig through safely. To get under the rail lines near South Station, the crews used a technique called tunnel jacking, freezing the waterlogged soil solid by pumping freezing brine through hundreds of pipes, then forcing the massive concrete tunnel sections horizontally through the frozen earth. The scale of material was staggering. Enough concrete poured to build a 4-inch thick sidewalk from Boston to San Francisco and back 3 times, and 5 miles of underground walls, the largest use of that construction method ever attempted in North America. But the Big Dig became infamous less for its engineering than for what went wrong. It was originally estimated to cost $2.6 billion and to be finished by 1998. It was not completed until 2007, and the highway work alone cost $14.6 billion, a figure that climbs to around $24 billion once the decades of interest on the borrowing are counted, a debt that will not be paid off until 2038. The project leaked. As far back as 2001, the authorities knew there were thousands of leaks in the new tunnels, and in 2004, water came pouring through a tunnel wall traced to debris that had been left in the concrete during construction. The company that supplied much of the concrete was later caught having delivered thousands of truckloads that were substandard or had failed inspection, and 6 of its employees were arrested for fraud. The darkest moment came in July 2006. A woman named Milena Del Valle was riding in a car through one of the connector tunnels toward the airport when a section of the concrete ceiling gave way and fell on the vehicle, 12 tons of concrete panel crushing the car and killing her. The investigation found the cause was the epoxy glue used to hold the heavy ceiling panels to the tunnel roof, a fast-setting adhesive that was never suitable for bearing that kind of long-term load and that slowly crept and pulled loose over time. The failure of a group of the bolts set off a chain reaction that dropped the whole panel. The tunnel was closed for the better part of a year, while every suspect fastener was replaced, and the companies that oversaw the project eventually paid more than $450 million in settlements. For all of that, the thing it was built to do, it did. The elevated highway that had split Boston for half a century was torn down, and in its place, the city built a ribbon of parks running through downtown so that for the first time in 50 years, people could walk from the center of the city to the waterfront without passing under a highway. The drive through the heart of Boston that once took nearly 20 minutes in traffic now takes under 3. It reshaped the city, opened the waterfront to development, and buried the road that had scarred it at a cost in money and time and one life that made it a cautionary tale told on every major construction project since. The Big Dig hit a road underground to heal a city. On a remote French island in the Indian Ocean, engineers faced a road so exposed to falling rock and raging sea that the only way to save it was to abandon the land entirely and build the new highway out over the ocean on what became the most expensive road in France. Réunion is a small volcanic island in the Indian Ocean east of Madagascar, and though it sits thousands of kilometers from Europe, it is legally a part of France and the European Union. The island's most important road, the coastal highway linking the capital of Saint-Denis to the main port, was built in 1959 along a narrow strip of land wedged between the open ocean on one side and towering volcanic cliffs on the other. Around 70,000 to 80,000 vehicles use it every day, and it is one of the most dangerous major roads in France. The cliffs above it are constantly eroded by tropical rain and heat, sending rocks and sometimes entire sections of hillside crashing down onto the road below, and the sea on the other side, whipped up by the cyclones that regularly strike the island with winds over 200 kilometers an hour, throws waves straight across the carriageway. The road has to be closed around 40 times a year, and since 1976, rockfalls and accidents on it have killed 22 people. In one rockfall in March 2006, part of the cliff collapsed onto the road and killed 2. The solution the French government settled on was radical. Rather than try to defend the road against the cliffs and the sea, they would move it off the land entirely and build a new highway out over the ocean, beyond the reach of the falling rock. This is the Nouvelle Route du Littoral, the new coastal road, and it is built to run about 12.5 kilometers across the sea, carried on viaducts and causeways set out in the water off the coast. It is known as the most expensive road in France and one of the most expensive roads ever built anywhere, working out to around 200 million euros for every kilometer. The engineering is closer to an offshore oil project than to normal road building. The showpiece is a viaduct 5.4 kilometers long, the longest in France, carrying a road 30 meters wide with 3 lanes in each direction. It is raised high enough above the water to clear the swells and built to last 100 years against 10-meter waves and cyclonic winds. To build it, the crews cast the bridge sections on land in dedicated concrete plants, then floated them out to sea. Setting the foundations required a specialized barge brought in from Europe, a floating platform roughly the size of a football pitch, nicknamed Zurite after the Creole word for octopus. That's because it has extendable legs that anchor it to the seabed and lifting systems that lowered massive concrete foundations, each weighing around 4,500 tons, onto the ocean floor with precision. It took 4 years just to place all the supports. But then the road ran into another problem. The final stretch of the route, connecting to the town of La Possession, was designed as a causeway built up from the seabed and armored with rock to absorb the force of the sea. That causeway needed around 3 million tons of rock, and the plan was to quarry it from sites on the island. But those quarries would have done serious environmental damage to the coastline, and environmental groups challenged the permits in court and won. Construction ground to a halt. The road, which had been meant to eliminate the danger of the old coastal route, was left incomplete, with drivers forced back onto the very cliff road it was designed to replace to get past the missing section. The costs, meanwhile, kept climbing, driven up by the legal battles, the delays, and the compensation claims, from an initial budget of around $1.8 billion toward a final figure now estimated at roughly $3 billion. In the end, the engineers gave up on the causeway and decided to replace it too with a viaduct. After years of suspension, preliminary work on the final section restarted in late 2025, with full construction expected to begin in 2027 and the whole road finally finished, in theory, by 2030. When it is done, more than 15 years after it began, the tens of thousands of people who drive the old coastal road every day will at last be able to travel out over the open ocean, away from the falling rock and the crashing sea, on a highway built entirely on the water because the land itself had become too dangerous to drive on. Which of these highways seemed the most impressive? Comment your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this video, check out our mini documentary on the craziest megaprojects in the world. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Signum for more insane stories behind the world's greatest megabuilds.